So when I think about investing in personal finance, there's the kind of tried and true stuff, which is like, look, you got to spend less than you make. Otherwise, you can't save. And if you can't save, you don't have dollars to invest. And I'm not necessarily a wild, crazy investor. I'm pretty kind of a little bit plain vanilla with most of my money. I'm, pretty long on global stock markets and investing in low cost, diverse ETFs and index funds. And, I've been doing that at Wealthfront for a while. When it comes to hacks and optimizations, though, I'm a big fan of all the different types of tax optimizations. Backdoor Roth, if you're needing to borrow, there's some optimizations that are probably a little too crazy. If interest rates are low and you want to invest money, you can invest money that you've borrowed if you have enough capital to do that and write off the interest as investment interest expense.
Securities-based lending.
Exactly. I think the market today, it's kind of interesting because of the limitations you can put on yourself. Right. If you have a portfolio of, let's call it $100,000, it's unlikely that if it's in a globally diverse portfolio of the market, it's going to drop 90%. Right. That would have to be like absolutely unprecedented global economic collapse. And so, the idea of needing to keep all of your cash on the sidelines for an emergency, if you have access to low cost borrowing, is kind of an interesting position to be in. Do I keep cash for emergencies? Absolutely. I'm totally a fan of an emergency fund. But I think the low interest rate environment has left kind of those short to medium term goals as things that, if they're not massive and the most important thing in the world, being able to take a little bit more risk in the markets right now is something that I think I'm comfortable with, knowing that there's ways to access your money and a lot more consumer friendly platforms, right? It used to be like you could only borrow against your investments if you had millions of dollars. And now platforms like Wealthfront allow you to, a lot of brokerage firms allow you to do it at relatively low interest rates, 1%, 2%, 3%. I'm a big fan of HSAs, FSAs for dependent care, for healthcare, like any of these programs where someone is offering to waive your tax bills. I'm all in, in every way. So if you're in a world where a high deductible health plan makes sense, maxing out your HSA, getting tax-free on the way in, tax-free on the way out, tax-free growth. Like, gosh, I wish everyone kind of knew about HSAs and used them as well as they could. And, I don't plan on spending the money in my HSA for a long time.
Yeah, maybe we can touch on that because you're right. I think it's something not really talked about much. It's kind of siloed into that bucket that is employee benefits and HR. And, it's not really something that we kind of bucket into the idea of long-term investing and diversification. Like in the case of me, I know even if you don't have an employer, if you're like an entrepreneur or, sole proprietor, essentially, you can still open your own HSA and take the tax benefits there. So maybe can you like give us an example of some of the basics of what that is and either direct people to, look if your employer offers that or look into something like that of having that account for yourself?
Yeah, if you have an HSA, whether you've had it in the past or now, and by the way, you're only eligible for an HSA if you're on a high deductible health plan. So if you're on a PPO or an HMO, you might not be eligible. But if you are on a high deductible health plan, oftentimes your employer will say, hey, if you want to automatically contribute, use our HSA that we have, a prearranged agreement with. And if your employer will deposit money into that account, by all means, that's like the best thing ever, right? Free money. It's like a 401k match. It's like you should definitely take advantage of the free money. The crazy thing is that you don't need your employer to have an HSA set up for you to use one. You could just open one. There are a couple startups. Lively is one of them. Starship is another one that kind of offer lower cost HSA options with more flexible investments. I know I used to have one with a company called, I'm going to mess up the name. I don't want to throw a company under the bus with the wrong name, but whoever was doing my HSA back in the day, it was like a $12 fee after I left my employer. And, I only had $1,000, $2,000 in there. So every month I was watching $12 go down, and I transferred it over to Lively personally. And not only does it not have a monthly fee, but it's just directly tied into TD Ameritrade. So I can go invest my HSA like I would invest my brokerage account or my IRA. And I can pick what I want that in. So do I want it in index funds? Do I want it in, whatever? And for me, that money is pretty long-term horizon because I'm not going to pay taxes on any of the gains or using any of the money. And unfortunately, I wish this weren't true, but I expect that I will have a lot of medical bills when I get older. And so I can't imagine being in a situation when I'm, older and have an HSA with a lot of money in it, that I won't be able to find a need for paying some medical expenses in my old age. I'm a big fan, if you have the cash flow, of actually keeping that HSA for a long time. A real cool hack that I've learned is I don't think there's a length of time on which you can redeem. You can kind of expense things. So if you want to keep all of your expenses, you don't have to take an expense from 2021 and, kind of turn it into your HSA and reimburse yourself in 2021. So you could collect and keep all your medical expenses your whole life. And if you get to a point where you're like, wow, healthcare in America is fixed, everything's free, I don't need to have all this money in my HSA, you could reimburse yourself for expenses that you had years or even decades ago.
So keep all your receipts then.
Yeah. I mean, it's not fun. I like to just take pictures of them and put them in a Dropbox folder and hope I never need to look at it. But, I'm making sure I leave every option open for those tax-free benefits.
I do know another small startup that offers an HSA. They're called Fidelity.
Yeah, they have them at, when I worked at Wells Fargo, they had them at the time. They may not anymore. The one that we had with Wells, they didn't match, but they would open the account for us. And if you work for the company, there were no fees to put the money in the HSA, but the investment options were like 6. And they're all Wells Fargo ETFs, and that was the extent of it. I think eventually they did let you branch out and buy Wells Fargo stock, but yeah, that was about the extent of it. So it wasn't, there weren't lots of choices like, the options that you guys are talking about. So
yeah. But unlike a company 401k where you almost always have to keep the money in the 401k your company has until you leave, you have more flexibility with your HSA. And some employers, I was talking with somebody at Starship, which I haven't used. They were saying you can set up your direct deposit through your employee's payroll to go straight into an HSA for another company, and they can kind of tag it accordingly. But look, if you don't have a high deductible health plan, FSAs are out there also, and you can do them for healthcare. You can do them for dependent care. So if you're a parent, you have childcare, tax-free money right there. And a lot of people just don't know about it and don't do it. So I'm a big fan of running through all of your HR benefits at your employer, or if you're self-employed, looking at which of those benefits you can do on your own. You can open up a SEP IRA as a self-employed person and contribute oftentimes a lot more to your retirement than you can as an employed person.
Yeah. So to recap, we have the HSA. That's a health savings account. That's something that most everybody should be able to open, whether it's a broker like Fidelity or elsewhere, or with your employer. And you can keep it with, and there's all sorts of benefits to that. Something I don't think we've talked about on the show, however many episodes we've done, 200 plus. We've never talked about the Backdoor Roth, but that's a really cool trick.
Yeah.
For people who make a higher income. So basically the backstory is you can deposit into a Roth IRA, and there's a deposit limit, $6,000 a year as of right now. We're always trying to tell people who listen to our show, you're just starting out, make sure you get at least a Roth IRA. The problem is once you start to make too much money, then you don't qualify for the Roth IRA. But there is a way today that you can still do that with the Backdoor Roth. So can you explain that for people who might be in that situation?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because those limits aren't location dependent. So if you're living in a major city, you might not feel like you make a lot of money, but you might still not be eligible for a Roth IRA. So the way it works, and the big caveat I'll give out there, is if you already have money in a traditional IRA, you want to go do your homework and do some extra reading because there's some tax issues. But if you've never opened up an IRA of any kind and you realize that you're in a situation where you're not eligible for a Roth IRA, you can actually make what's called a non-deductible contribution to a traditional IRA, which means you don't get any tax benefits, which on its own wouldn't really make sense. Why would you put money into an account with restrictions with no benefits? And the reason is that you can take the money in your traditional IRA and you can roll it over to a Roth IRA. Why the IRS has kind of given the okay that you can do this, but you can't just directly contribute to it, I have no idea. It seems like disservice to people who don't have access to all the information, and that's unfortunate. So I'm glad we can share it here. Maybe one day we could just make no income or kind of caps on Roth IRAs so that people can do it just easily. But yeah, if you are able to open up a traditional IRA, you can contribute to it, and that it's a non-deductible contribution, and then you can roll it into a Roth IRA. And then the great thing about a Roth IRA is you've already paid taxes on that money. As long as it grows into your retirement age, you don't have to pay taxes on any of the gains when you take it out. There's also the flexibility of you can take out the contributions you've made to it without penalties and fees, but obviously you have to pay a penalty or fee on the gains if you have them. But there's a little bit more flexibility on how you can access your money than you would get even in a 401k. So, I typically tell people if you're young and liquidity is a thing, you might need to pay a bill, a medical expense. If you don't have access to cash, it can be scary to tie it all up in a retirement account. And a Roth IRA gives you a little bit more flexibility in that way than even your 401k, your company. But if your company matches the 401k, it's hard for anything to be a better deal than free money.